and then I'll come over and push. So I just make sure I know which button to push.
Mientras terminamos de hacer los ajustes de la presentación, les recuerdo, sobre todo para aquellos que vienen de fuera, que tenemos preparada con un maestro de la UNAM, casi doctor en arquitectura, una visita privada para el próximo sábado. Hay pocos lugares ya, tenemos una visita al centro histórico.
No, we don't want that. We just want that one.
Todo eso se tiene que anotar con tiempo, porque es un sábado y tenemos que ver los vehículos que vamos a usar.
There we go.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Cool.
You mean
You're the boss. You're the boss. Yeah, I noticed there's. I guess there's. Oh, I've been in Mexico before. Never given a presentation in Mexico before. I see there's. I may have to look at your watch every once in a while, or you'll warn me when I'm running out of time. Well, if we just set it there, then I can. Yeah, because I see there's no clock in this room. So. Yep, and a PhD from Northwestern. Yeah. And you're the dean, I understand. Yes. It's a tough job. I was an associate dean for a while. Yes.
How do you say in boxing? To throw my towel?
Oh, throw the towel in, yes. Yes.
Okay. Buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Es un gusto tener con nosotros al doctor Rick Szostak. El doctor Szostak tiene un MBA en Economía de la Universidad de Montreal y es doctor en Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad de Northwestern en Interdisciplinary. Es profesor de Economía en la Universidad de Alberta, Canadá, donde se unió al Departamento de Economía en 1985. Se desempeñó como decano asociado de la Facultad de Artes desde 2002 a 2005. Fue presidente de la Asociación de Personal Académico de la Universidad de Alberta en 1995-1996 y presidente de la Confederación de Asociaciones de Profesores de Alberta de 1996 a 1998. Ha sido miembro de la Junta Directiva de la Asociación de Estudios Integrados la mayor parte de la última década. Ha sido miembro de los consejos rectores de los programas interdisciplinarios en humanidades, informática, ciencias, tecnología y sociedad y estudios religiosos de la Universidad de Alberta. Fue presidente de la Asociación de Estudios Interdisciplinarios de 2011 a 2014. Ha estado en la Universidad de Alberta durante 30 años, pero también ha sido profesor visitante en la Universidad de Nueva Gales del Sur y en el Instituto Universitario Europeo de Florencia. Los intereses de investigación de Szostak abarcan los campos de la historia económica, la metodología, la historia de la tecnología, la ética, el estudio de la ciencia de la información y sobre todo la teoría y la práctica de la interdisciplinaridad. El foco de su investigación en las últimas décadas ha sido facilitar la investigación interdisciplinaria, la enseñanza y la administración del programa. Es autor de 11 libros, 8 libros como autor y 3 en coautoría y más de 30 artículos de revistas. Sus principales publicaciones, Allen Record y Szostak, Rick, Introducción a la Interdisciplinariedad, Rick Szostak, Restoring Human Progress, y han coeditado los trabajos de Case Studies in Interdisciplinary Research, FF Redcott, William Machine Newman, Rick Szostak, editores. El día de hoy Él nos va a presentar una ponencia sobre la investigación interdisciplinaria y el envejecimiento. Sin duda, el tema del envejecimiento es un tema multidisciplinario. Precisamente el programa universitario de envejecimiento prueba su carácter interdisciplinario en todos los que participan en este programa. Y el doctor Szostak presenta una ponencia realmente interesante porque no se mete en una discusión abstracta epistemológica, sino que lo lleva a una cuestión de orden práctico, metodológico. Es una ponencia realmente interesante y estamos atentos a su ponencia.
Gracias.
Szostak, bienvenido.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. ¿Cómo está? Gracias. There we go. Just a sec.
¿No está grabando el
Yes. No? Have I got to turn? Do I have to push a button? The light's on. It's weak. C'est verde. I have to do this one? Okay. Gracias al comité organización por la invitación. That's all the Spanish I know. That's actually not true. Dos cervezas, por favor. Thanks to the generosity of the Mexican people, you can actually travel in this country for weeks at a time with only those 10 words. So that's all I've mastered. So thank you. I guess maybe I'll move over here so I can push the buttons. So our plan today is to talk about the field of interdisciplinary studies and to provide some implications from that literature for the study of aging. I should say right away then that the assumption of this field of interdisciplinary studies that I've been involved in for decades is that there are general lessons. And so I go around and I speak to lots of conferences on lots of different topics, and I say largely the same thing. So hopefully this will work for us all, that we can apply this general knowledge to the study of aging. There is a third task that I have, especially at this point in the afternoon, which is to try not to bore you to tears with this presentation. We'll work on that. I'm always worried when I get an introduction that describes that many of my publications that the audience sits there and thinks, he must be really boring. So we'll try to dispel that idea as we move forward. When I started out as an academic a little while ago, it was still pretty common for people to say that interdisciplinarity was impossible, that you had to spend an entire lifetime to master one discipline, and so anyone who attempted to look at more than one was clearly going to be doing superficial analysis. Now, of course, university presidents and granting agencies around the world talk about interdisciplinarity, and so the surprising result of that is that many people claim to be interdisciplinary without actually thinking very much about what that means. And so I think the way to think of that is that within a generation, interdisciplinarity has gone from being impossible to being really easy. And that's still a problem. Okay? It was clearly a problem when people thought it was impossible, but it's also a problem if people think it's easy. The truth is that interdisciplinarity is quite possible, but it's difficult. And that once you accept that the truth is somewhere in between impossible and easy, then the challenge is to figure out how to do it best. And that's why the group of scholars that I've been involved with over the last couple of decades has been striving to identify best ways of going about interdisciplinary research and teaching. That may be too small for you to look at. I did want to kind of So we're going to mostly talk about interdisciplinarity, but I did think it was useful to reflect at the start about why is the study of aging an interdisciplinary field? And part of the answer is that there's a whole bunch of different phenomena that have an effect on the well-being of the aging population. Okay, so, and I know I've missed some. I know in our morning plenary we talked about how we have to design products like light switches. That's not on my diagram here, so I know it's not inclusive. But the idea is that, you know, with a little bit of reflection, we can see that there's a lot of factors that affect the well-being of the elderly. That on its own wouldn't be a problem. If they were all independent, we could just add up the insights of different disciplines. But the challenge is that they interact. Okay, so again, as we saw this morning, the physical activity level of elderly people is influenced a lot by their incomes and their education. So what we have then is this complex process where a whole bunch of variables or phenomena interact with each other in influencing the thing that we care about, the well-being of the aging population. And that's what requires us then to take an interdisciplinary approach to the study of aging. Because individual disciplines may be able to get little pieces of the puzzle, but only an interdisciplinary analysis is going to be able to see how these various interactions influence the aging. All right. So during that wonderful introduction, it was mentioned that I've co-authored a few things with Alan Repko. I put this book up on the screen. So if I go too fast and you miss anything, a lot of what I say today is in this book by Alan Repko. It was the first textbook on how to do interdisciplinary research. It was aimed primarily at senior undergraduates, but given that interdisciplinarity is a new topic to a lot of us, it's very useful for graduate students and scholars as well. It's now, as I say, in the second edition. Just a couple weeks ago, Alan asked me to work on the third edition with him. Don't wait for it, go out and buy the second edition, but my name will be in really little print on the third edition when that comes around. And what Repko does is outline a 10-step process for doing research and then identify a bunch of strategies that work for each one of those. And he provides examples from across the academy for each of these steps and strategies. And so that's an important, again, once we've recognized that interdisciplinarity is possible but difficult, then it makes sense to see what lessons we can learn so that we all don't have to figure out how to do interdisciplinary analysis on our own. And of course, you can't have a textbook until there's a literature that you can draw upon. And so Repko's book was only possible because there is this growing consensus out there that there's been hundreds of scholars looking at how to do interdisciplinary research and teaching. They'd come to enough consensus that it made sense to have a textbook. Okay, there's another resource out there, the association that was mentioned that I was president of for a couple of years, the Association for Interdisciplinary Studies. There's a lot of resources on its website about how to do interdisciplinarity, including a section of the website called About Interdisciplinarity, which provides definitions and mostly discusses best practices for teaching and research, and also for administration. Okay, so the kind of interdisciplinarity that I talk about is problem-oriented, and that's a perfect fit for our audience, that we're collectively concerned with the situation of aging people. And so what we want to know then is how we can apply interdisciplinary techniques to that particular challenge. And the starting point for interdisciplinary analysis is, it's not on this slide, but a recognition that, of course, the specialized research that goes on in disciplines is incredibly valuable. So we shouldn't, when we're talking about interdisciplinarity, we should recognize that, you know, it's not the only game in town, that there is a value in the specialized research that goes on in disciplines. And that value comes from the fact that if a group of scholars shares a set of theories and a methods and studies the same set of things, then they can converse really easily. They don't have to start every paper or every class explaining their theory or method because everyone's using the same theory and method. Okay, and that's incredibly powerful. But the starting point for interdisciplinarity is a recognition that, as that flowchart chart showed, the things we study interact, and also that all theories and all methods have their strengths and weaknesses. And so that in disciplines, when you're doing specialized research, there's that wonderful advantage, but you'll necessarily miss insights that could come from looking at other variables or using other theories or other methods. Okay, one important concept that has been clarified over the last little while is this idea that every discipline has a way of looking at the world. And that if you don't kind of take that as a starting point for interdisciplinary analysis, you're going to have problems right away. Okay, so as was mentioned, I started out as an economist. Okay, so economists tend to assume that people are rational, okay, that we all make our decisions using rational calculations. And one of the beauties of that for economic practice is if you make that assumption in your theory, then you don't have to look inside people's brains. All you have to do is make an assumption about what they want, and we of course assume that they want money. And then you just have to know what their choice set is, what are their options, and you know that they'll choose the best one. And that means that the theory really lends itself to mathematical modeling and statistical analysis. Okay, that these things fit together, that disciplines don't just randomly choose theories and methods and subject matter. They choose methods that are good at investigating their theories, and then they apply those theories and methods together to a set of variables that those theories and methods fit. A sociologist comes along and says, no, people aren't completely rational. They're affected by culture, or they have decision rules that they follow, or they're affected by peer pressure. And that doesn't really lend itself to mathematical modeling. It really guides you to go out and ask people how they make decisions. So if the sociologist then goes to the economist and says, I just did a bunch of interviews, and people say that they don't make decisions rationally, well, the economist then says, well, you've got a stupid theory, and you investigated it with a stupid method, and so of course you got the wrong result. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're engaged in interdisciplinary communication, that each discipline has this whole integrated way of viewing the world, and when you come from outside that perspective, they just look at you like you're speaking nonsense. Okay? And so it's easy for people in one discipline, when they look at work in another discipline, they simultaneously think, well, there's something wrong with that theory, there's something wrong with that method, and they're looking at the wrong variables anyway. And so if we don't realize that, then when we as interdisciplinarians are drawing on insights from different disciplines, we don't analyze them very well, we don't evaluate them very well. And when we try to communicate back to disciplines, we're not heard because we're not trying to break through that perspective and speak to them in a language they can understand. And then the final characteristic of the kind of interdisciplinarity that I advocate is that we then try to integrate across these perspectives. Okay, so that little story I told about the economist and the sociologist, you might be tempted to just throw up your hands and say, there's nothing we can do about it. But if we recognize that people in practice use a mix of rational and non-rational decision making, then we can in fact draw upon both the economist and the sociologist and put their ideas together and come up with a better understanding than either one of them can do on their own. Okay? And that's the real beauty of interdisciplinary analysis. Okay? And so the important thing is that we don't think that disciplines are wrong, we just think that they're limited. Okay? They're partly right, but they miss some things. And what we want to do is take the parts that are right, integrate them, and come up with a better understanding. Okay. And again, to stress then that there's this symbiotic relationship that interdisciplinarity has to draw on this specialized research, and then ideally it feeds ideas back to specialized researchers. Okay, the other thing that I'm sure you're all familiar with is that the modern research university has been developed in an age of disciplines. So it's organized around disciplines. So I won't go into it a lot today, but of course there's these institutional barriers to interdisciplinarity as well. How do you do interdisciplinary research if you're situated in a discipline? When you come up for tenure, are your publications in 5 different fields, given appropriate credit and so on? And there's advice that we have up on that website for how to deal with these institutional challenges as well. All right. So the good news for interdisciplinarity is that you don't need the same level of expertise in a discipline to draw upon it as you need to do research in that discipline. Okay? So you can potentially draw on 3 or 4 disciplines. You shouldn't be expected to know as much about each one of them as someone who specializes in that discipline. But you should know the perspective. Okay? As I said before, and think of it, if you read one paper in economics, okay, that economist doesn't have to, at the start of the paper, explain that he's assuming rationality or that he's only going to look at variables that can be quantified or anything like that, because that's just assumed in economics. And so if you just read one paper and you're unfamiliar with the perspective of economics, you'll have a misleading impression. But if you have that impression, if you know what the disciplinary perspective of economics is, then you look at that paper and you say, oh, are people really rational? Was that a reasonable assumption? Okay. Are there variables that are hard to quantify that I would include in a study if I was doing it? Okay. So if you place each thing that you read in the context of that disciplinary perspective, you're in a much better situation to decide what's good in that paper and to think, oh, to what extent is it just displaying the perspective of that discipline, and to what extent is it actually telling me something useful about how the world works? And of course, you also then have to read things. You don't have to read everything in economics, but you should read several things that economists say about aging to get a sense of the disagreements in the field. Okay, and that's it. So that's not really challenging, but if you do those things, if you learn a bit about the disciplines that you draw upon, and you read several things about your topic in that discipline, you can intelligently draw upon that discipline in your own research. Right. So we will actually get to REPCO, or some of REPCO's 10 steps, but there's a little bit of preliminary stuff. So there's 2 problems when we try to communicate across disciplines. I should pause. I know this is being translated, so am I going too fast? Too slow? Just right? You're such a wonderful audience. Thank you. So there's 2 big communication problems that we have to recognize. The first one I've already talked a little bit about with perspectives. If you find yourself doing team research, especially, there is this approach that's been developed by some people I know, a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, where what they would do is they would go to interdisciplinary research teams and they would give them a questionnaire, largely epistemological questions. What can we know? How do we know things? Some methodological questions. What are the best ways to do research? And of course, if you have an interdisciplinary research team, you get quite different answers to these things. And then what the toolbox team would do is they would go back to the group and say, look, these are your different answers. Let's have a conversation as to why you gave quite different answers to these epistemological and methodological questions. They'd have a conversation. They'd give the questionnaire again, and they would find out that people moved closer to each other. Okay, they didn't all agree, but they understood a little bit of why other people in the research team had given different answers, and so when they redid the questionnaire, people weren't quite as far apart. And on top of that, when they asked the research team, did you understand why other people gave their answers? There was a general understanding. Yes, this is the way I approach science, but I understand that these other people approach it in a different way. And hopefully, and again, they did some follow-up research, then the research team going forward, there's still communication problems, but they're much less, because now when someone says something, you think, yes, they're saying that because they have this different view of how science should proceed from my view. And I now at least know where they're coming from. Okay, so the lesson there is, again, the best way to deal with this difference in perspectives is to try to understand the perspectives of other disciplines that you're dealing with. Okay, and it's a challenge, but it's something that's not that hard to overcome. In the Repco book, he tries to give these thumbnail sketches of a bunch of the key disciplines. They're not perfect thumbnail sketches, but at least it's a start on that road that you can learn a lot about a discipline by just reading a paragraph or two about them and reflecting on what that means. And then the second challenge, and this is more subtle. Well, they're both subtle because, again, I guess one thing to stress about disciplinary perspectives is they're largely subconscious. Okay, so I spent 5 years in a PhD program in economics. They never came out and explicitly said, Rick, this is the way economists think. They just kind of, if you thought the right way, you got good marks on your exams, and if you thought the wrong way, you got bad marks on your exams. And after 5 years, you either flunk out, or you learn to give the right answers, and you learn to think like a person in that discipline. So, again, these disciplinary perspectives are largely subconscious, and so you have to kind of make them explicit before you can then try to learn other people's perspectives. You have to be conscious of your own perspective before you can learn other people's. The second problem is subtle as well, and that's that we just put different definitions on words. And so it's very easy to miscommunicate simply because we define words in particular ways. So the word aging, to some people, I think the word aging just means simply getting older. Whereas clearly for other people, the word aging has a connotation of, becoming weaker, less powerful, losing certain capabilities. And so you can imagine how easily it would be to miscommunicate if one person means aging as simply getting older, and for someone else it has this clear connotation of, losing certain capabilities. And another word that I came across, I was at a conference of people who try to get disabled people active. And of course, one of the challenges in that field is the word disability, which a lot of people now don't use, because of course, disability implies that you can't do something. Whereas, of course, what this whole field is about was trying to get people to do things despite the fact that they had some sort of physical or psychological impairment is the word that they preferred, because impairment implies you've got a challenge, but maybe you can overcome it. Okay, so again, for some people, disability actually already meant that they knew that you could overcome disabilities to some extent, whereas for other people, a disability meant automatically there's a bunch of things you can't do. So I just throw these out as a couple of examples of fairly simple differences in definition that can really easily lead to big communication problems. And there's a book on that too. Okay, and these are the problems that you have if you're trying to communicate. And then, of course, there are still people out there in disciplines who don't want to communicate. And so we should also recognize that there's power relations in the academy, turf wars, disciplines that think they're better than each other. And then just basic human psychology. After you've spent 5 years getting your PhD and 5 years getting tenure, there's a tendency to think, what I know is more important than what you know. And why should I talk to you? And in the study of aging, all of these problems are going to be really big just because of what we call the epistemological distance. The way people get trained in medical schools is so different from the way they get trained in English departments. You have a huge gap to bridge in the study of aging because there is just this huge range of disciplines that are involved. Okay. One thing that I wanted to warn you about, I don't think it's a real problem for aging, but I did want you to be aware of it, is that a lot of fields that start out as interdisciplinary become a lot like disciplines over time. That they're, again, given that we have an academy that is built around disciplines, and we have these reward structures which tend to reward us for knowing one theory and one method really well, there's this temptation for a field that has these wonderful interdisciplinary aspirations to nevertheless come over time to kind of just use one or two theories and one or two methods and start to look like a discipline. So I think that's just something that every interdisciplinary field needs to be aware of. I think given the range of phenomena that interact in the study of aging, that's probably not a huge danger for you. But again, there is that temptation for a field like this to come to favor just one or two theories and one or two methods. And you should all be kind of careful about not letting that happen, I think. Okay. So before, again, we will get to the steps in a couple minutes, but I did want to be honest here and say that not everyone agrees that it's a good idea to try to identify the best strategies for doing interdisciplinary research. So I tried to address that in a chapter I wrote for this book a couple of years ago. Hey, one of the really clever things that I did when I came and sat over here is I left your watch way over there, so I have no clue how much time I've used. So maybe I'll. Okay. I was flown in as an expert on curricular design by an American university once, and I was giving this presentation, and the university president and all the vice presidents were there, and there was 500 people in the room. And I kept looking at my watch as I gave my presentation, thinking, wow, I've got lots of time, I've got lots of time. And about the third time I looked at my watch, I thought, that minute hand has not moved. And it turned out that my watch had coincidentally died at the start of my talk, which is why I'm relying on your watch, but anyway. Okay, so one concern then is that a lot of us became interdisciplinary because we felt constrained by our disciplines, so people don't want interdisciplinarity to become constrained. And my answer is that we can identify best practices without doing what disciplines do, which is limiting in any way the theories or methods or phenomena that you look at. Okay. And if we can do that sort of thing, then we can get some of the advantages of disciplines. If we identify best ways of doing interdisciplinary research, then we don't have to start each paper by justifying what we're doing. There will be a community of interdisciplinary scholars that will know why we're doing certain things. And again, there is this challenge that in a world where interdisciplinarity is lauded but not well understood, we need standards for evaluating good interdisciplinary research. Okay. I think I'll skip that. You always, in any PowerPoint presentation, you always have to skip some slides so that people will think you know more than you're actually saying. So I'll do that. So we're finally on to the steps. I'm not sure whether that was funny or you were just getting the translation of what I said before. That's okay. Good. So it was funny in Spanish too. That's good. Okay. So anyway, well, that was amazing. I didn't do that. Is that like a sign from God that I'm done? Or? There we go. Okay, so if you hit the up arrow, you're done. That's a good thing to know. Okay, so the steps themselves are not that exciting. Ask a good question, identify the relevant disciplines, evaluate them. We've talked a fair bit about evaluate. We've talked a little bit about integrating. So so we've talked about, let's go back to this flow chart. I'm really proud of this. So a couple things so we know that I'm now trying to move fast. Okay, so again, as I confessed before, I know that my flow chart is missing some things. I think, again, I don't expect that everyone doing research on aging looks at all those variables, but it's important for us all to realize that what we're studying is a part of this big, complex picture. One of the things that it leads to in a policy way is that if we're actually going to help the aging, we probably have to do more than one thing. That given all these different phenomena interact, probably helpful policies work on several different things at the same time. And I think the other thing to stress is that not all of these links are obvious. Some of the things I heard this morning hadn't been obvious to me as I was doing research and preparing this talk. I mean, there's this literature that talks about how depressed people are more subject to fraud. So there's a link between mental health and fraud, which I would not have thought of before. And of course, the other thing to stress is that there's arrows in the other direction, that it's a mistake to think of aging as a problem, but we should think of the aging as a resource. I don't know about you, but I am a lot smarter than when I was 20. And I expect to be even smarter when I'm 75, and I expect my children to keep listening to me. And so I think we should recognize you're obviously doing a great job translating, or maybe you're doing stuff that I'm not doing, and you're even funnier than I am. So, anyway. But I think it's useful to think of the aging as a resource rather than just a problem. Okay, I'm not going to be able to go through this whole slide in detail. The thing is that there's a bunch of different kinds of theories out there, and some published work of mine that I'm too shy to advertise. I've come up with a classification of theory types. Let's just do this second bullet here. So some theories look at how individuals operate. Some theories look at how groups of people operate. Some theories look at how relationships between people operate. And I think in the study of aging, it's not hard to imagine that we need all three types of these theories. That sometimes we want to understand how individuals make decisions, how sometimes we want to understand how groups are acting, sometimes we want to understand, say, the patient-doctor relationship. Okay, so I could go through all these other bullets. There's a bunch of there's 5 main dimensions along which theories differ, and that just supports the message that to really understand a complex process like aging, we're going to need more than one kind of theory. Okay, and that's an important thing because most of us are still trained in disciplines, and especially in my discipline of economics, we think, or my colleagues think, there's one theory that explains the whole world. And so the idea that you might need several theories to really understand something, that's quite a break with the way many of us, at least, were trained in our discipline. And of course, then we have to think the same thing about methods, because again, no method is perfect. Each method has strengths and weaknesses, and we want to be able to use multiple methods. Okay, and I didn't list, there's about a dozen of them. I didn't list them all here. But again, there's value in looking at many methods. Okay, we're moving along nicely here. So the really cool step, the most exciting thing about interdisciplinarity is integration. And I don't want to mislead you, it's a creative act, okay, to kind of combine the ideas from different disciplines and come up with some new way of looking at the world that involves some creativity. So nevertheless, there are some strategies. Okay, so the first one we've already dealt with. Sometimes disagreements between disciplines are simply because they're using words differently. And if you carefully define the words, sometimes you can get past that disagreement. Okay, sometimes all you need to do is extend a theory to include variables studied by other disciplines. Okay, organization involves drawing the sort of flow chart that I had, but a smaller one. So if what you were doing is, say this morning, what you wanted to do was get elderly people to exercise more, then, as our talk this morning illustrated, there's a handful of variables that interact in affecting how much people exercise. And so what I would suggest is that mapping out that set of connections and then thinking about which disciplines tell you about which of those arrows can give you a first step towards an interdisciplinary understanding of that particular challenge of getting elderly people to exercise more. And then transformation, we've actually already dealt a little bit. Okay, that's when you actually get disciplines that seem to be just disagreeing head on. Okay, so again, the economist saying people make rational decisions, and the sociologist saying people make non-rational decisions. Well, again, the answer is to put those things on a continuum and say, well, people in the real world are somewhere between being completely rational and completely non-rational. And if I think about where on that continuum they are in this situation, I know how much to draw on the economist theory and how much to draw on the sociologist theory. Okay, so trying to think of continua, whereas people in disciplines often think of, black versus white, we can, as interdisciplinarians, if we recognize shades of gray, we can draw upon those seemingly opposite points of view. Okay, and again, these are discussed both on that website I mentioned and in the Repco book with a whole bunch of examples. Okay, there's something, given the particular focus of Repco, he doesn't talk a lot about team building, but there is a literature out there. He doesn't talk about mixed method research, but there's a whole literature out there on that. He doesn't talk a lot about, he talks a little bit, but most of the research on interdisciplinarity has been how to bridge scientific differences rather than ethical differences. But there is some discussion out there, I've been involved in some of this literature, that some of the techniques that can bridge scientific disagreements can also be used to bridge ethical disagreements. And in the paper that I produced for this conference, I do talk about this a lot more because, of course, ethical issues are really important for the study of aging. And I guess, heck, I've got another 5 minutes. My first ever international conference when I was 26, I was on this huge panel with about 20 different people, and we were all given 5 minutes. And the Crown Prince of Japan went before me and used about 20. And the chairman wouldn't cut him off because he wanted a free trip to Japan. And so that meant that the rest of us didn't have 5 minutes. And I remember this because it was my first international conference. This was a big deal for me. And I paused for breath in the middle of a sentence, and he cut off my mic. There we go. Well done. You are a funny guy. And he said, "Thank you, Rick." And anyway. So I just used 2 of my 5 minutes with that story, but that's okay. This is a pet peeve of mine. The ethical, I don't know what it's like in Mexico, but in Canada, we've done this really wonderful job of teaching our children to value diversity. And that's a really important thing, especially in a multicultural country like Canada. But the side effect has been that when we do surveys of young people, we find that a lot of them, when they're asked ethical questions, say, "Oh, whatever people think. I would respect whatever people think." On pretty much any ethical question, including, ones about honesty and responsibility and things like that. And so I think the ethical challenge of our time is to applaud diversity, but still say, hey, we pretty much all agree on the value of honesty and responsibility and caring and things like that. And one of the things that struck me about this morning's presentation was that statistic about how many of our elderly, at least in Germany, don't have children. And one of the things I know is that the elderly people, the ones who need help, who have physical or mental disabilities, if their children don't stop by the home every once in a while and check up on the staff don't do what they're supposed to do. And so then it falls to society to make sure that elderly people who don't have children looking after them actually get the care that they deserve.